And welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. So today's topic is training, and we're going to discuss how to reduce low back pain during squats and deadlifts. So this was requested by a listener, so thank you for sending this request in. If anybody would like to request anything, you can always email us at brutalirongym@gmail.com. So let's get into a couple things. So what we're going to mostly look at today, and what this person mostly wanted to know, was different body positions. And they didn't really send a very concise question. That's why I'm not giving you the quote of the question. They sent a video of their squat and explained that they were having some lower back pain and kind of gave the history of what they'd been trying to do to correct it. And the feedback that I was able to give them was actually based on changing some cueing, which helped with their positioning. Gave them different accessory exercises to kind of correct and get these body positions kind of stronger and more set in place. And then as they put that together, it'll go better. So they already got to do a couple workouts with the new form, and said lower back was feeling great. They just have to get used to the new positions and try to hold those positions under heavier weights. So, which is normal. So whenever they go back to their heavier weight, the body kind of freaks out a little bit and reverts back to bad positions. So they're currently working through what is a light enough weight that I can do correctly, but heavy enough that it gives me a good stimulus for feedback on my form. So if they try to lift like a feather, they're not going to feel anything in their back, whether it's good or bad, because it's not heavy enough to cause any strain. So they have to find a heavy enough weight that their body kind of can give them feedback and go, ooh, man, this is an uncomfortable pressure. But it's not so heavy that they get injured or they fail to lift. So let's run down through this, and we'll expand on it as we go. So the first thing that we looked at for this person, you don't have to go in this order. So I'm going to present you, listeners, with 4 things to look at. And you don't have to do in the order. You'd actually want to look at all 4 of these, so I'm just going to go through them. But you would want to address all 4 if you can. So the first thing is head angle. So some people, when they're doing squats and deadlifts, you'll hear some people tell you to look up to the ceiling. Some people tell you to look quote-unquote straight ahead, which would be like parallel with the floor. And some people will tell you to kind of put your head down. So when I coach people for strength sport, even just aesthetics, so say somebody's squatting and deadlifting to build their butt or their thighs for aesthetic sports, or they're squatting and deadlifting because they're in powerlifting, or they're squatting and deadlifting because they want to get stronger at sport performance, or even like strongmen. So I do help some strong men and strong women with their competitions. So anybody, no matter what their goal is out of the lift, you want to put them in the healthiest, safest position. So we wouldn't tell somebody head up if it caused strain in their neck just because that was quote-unquote the right thing to do, or quote-unquote that's what everybody else does. None of that stuff. You want to find what's right for that person. Okay? Now, if you're listening to this for yourself, you want to find what's right for you. So I'm going to give you some advice on how to kind of have the best guess at what might work for you, but you still need to practice it and see what feels best. And I think the benefit of this podcast is just hearing what the possibilities are, so that way you know what to try, and then hearing that you have permission to do things, even if they're not quote-unquote normal by everybody else's standards. So I've trained people in strength sports to, elite totals, national records, and stuff like that. And I've had people who squatted differently. So some people squat with their head up, some people squat with their head neutral, and some people kind of parallel, eyes parallel with the floor, and some people squat with their head down. So I don't force anyone to do it any one particular way because everybody's built differently. So if you have anybody telling you that you have to have, your body in this certain position because that's the best for everyone, bullshit. So everybody's built differently. Whether you have a short torso or a long torso, whether you have long femurs or short femurs, and whether you have long arms in the deadlift or not, that all plays a role into what position will be best for you. So there's to be very, very, very careful when somebody tells you that, oh, everybody has to do it this way because it's quote-unquote the right way. So you can just go to, just go on YouTube and watch any powerlifting meet, like even the elite level lifters. There's going to be variability amongst the way that they do things. So they're going to have different widths of stance. They're going to have different bar positions. Some people have a high bar versus low bar in squatting. Deadlifts, obviously there's sumo versus conventional, but there's even differences in the way people do the conventional. There's differences in the way people do sumo. So some people do sumo with their eyes straight ahead, and some people do sumo with their eyes staring up to the ceiling. So you just have to find kind of like what fits you best. Okay? So head position, head angle. What we want to generally look for is that your neck is not strained. So you don't want to put the vertebrae of the neck or the muscles of the neck into a horrible, strained, tight position. So you want the neck feeling like flexed in the sense of like being braced against the weight, but it shouldn't be contracted into like an end range position where you feel like a bunch of biting, like hard pressure into your neck. So for most people, what I tend to recommend is to have their eyes parallel with the floor or slightly down, okay, as if they're looking at a spot on the floor about 10 to 15 feet in front of them. I do occasionally have people with their eyes straight down, like they're looking literally at the floor in between their feet. And it just kind of all depends on their movement mechanics. So what we're trying to figure out is if some people, if their head is up, and they're a rather hypermobile or rather mobile person, so they have flexibility to them. If their head is up, it tends to promote them to arch their lower back and push their stomach forward, which creates a weakness. It creates a kind of a kink in the back, so they don't have their abdomen tight. They don't have their abs tight to help brace with the spinal erectors to keep the middle of their body solid. So they tend to have their abs more relaxed. They're over-relying on their spinal erectors, and their lower back is going to get kind of annoyed during their squats. So if you bring their head down to a more neutral position, that tends to drop their rib cage down. That allows them to keep their abs more flexed, and then the abs can share the pressure with the spinal erectors and keep their core in the middle of their body more solid and tight. So if we think of it as a can of Coke, if I want to smash a Coke can, if I dent the side of it a little bit, I can then smash it easier. Well, if I have my abs relaxed and my lower back is kinked inwards, like arched inwards, that's almost like the dent into our core. And then the bar pushing down on you is like somebody trying to smash the can. So what we want to try to do is have your ab wall tight, and that way it's neutral and braced with the back muscles. So if you were to look at somebody from their hips up to their shoulders, they would look like they're in a straight line, not in an arch. So if you're familiar with lifting, we know the arch that you have on bench press, right? You don't want to have that arch when you squat and deadlift. You want to have a neutral spine, whatever you're like a normal, healthy spinal curve. So our spine is not straight up and down when we're standing, in it. We wouldn't want it to be. That's not a safe thing. But we don't want our upper back more rounded than it should be, and we don't want our lumbar, our low back, more internally, like, kind of arched than what it normally is. You want to try to maintain a normal position through the core. So I have one client, super duper strong dude, and he squats with his eyes kind of parallel to the floor, but he doesn't have any back pain. He has no overarching. His knees don't collapse. Nothing goes wrong. He's strong as hell, so we didn't change anything when I started working with him. I have another person, I'm just giving you like single person examples. We have another person that when they sent their videos, their head was like their eyes were parallel with the floor or slightly upward. When they would go to squat, their lower back would kind of kink and bend, their knees would cave inward towards the bottom of the squat, and as they tried to drive up off the floor, they felt like they had no power whatsoever. So they were kind of leading with their head, their chest was coming up, their back was really arched and kinked, their knees were caving in, and it was just basically a shit show of a squat. So, and they knew it, like they knew something was wrong. They didn't know how to fix it, but they knew something was wrong. So it wasn't like they didn't know any better or they didn't care. They were well aware something was wrong, they just didn't know what to fix. So for that person, one of the things we fixed, the first thing, was I told them to put their head down, so they stare at the floor. And what that did is it helped pull the rib cage down. It helped them have a better sense of their abs being flexed. And then since that did flex their abs well, their hip tilt positioning was more neutral. So it got them from their hip to their shoulder to be in a straight line. Now all of a sudden, now that the hips were in a better angle, their core was braced, as they squatted, the knees didn't have to cave in to try to find stability in the hips. They had stability in their core now. So their knees could stay out in the healthier, better position, and all of a sudden they weren't having pain during their squat. So simply changing their head angle kind of cascaded and changed everything all the way down to their feet and made everything go better. So that's something to think of. So what I've found in general is that if somebody is flexible, if they have the ability to arch their back when they squat, that they're going to be better off with their eyes parallel to the floor or downward. Very rarely will eyes up go well because they're going to arch their back, they're going to lift their rib cage, they're going to lose abdominal tightness, their hips are going to roll forward, and everything's just going to go bad. Now, if somebody isn't very mobile, so they're kind of muscle bound or they're stiff, they can get away with having their head up because as they lift their head, nothing follows. So they're not mobile enough or flexible enough for their rib cage to then lift by accident. So they just kind of like they'll lift their head and it helps tighten their upper back a little bit, but nothing cascadingly goes worse throughout their physique. But again, that tends to be people who are more muscle based, so they're less flexible already. So if you are not very flexible, you can probably get away with having your eyes parallel to the floor or even your head up a little bit just to create more upper back stiffness and tightness. If you are flexible, you need to probably be more careful of whether you have your head up. So you need to have your head more like eyes parallel with the floor or actually looking down towards the floor, like we said, about 10 to 15 feet in front of you. So that is going to help, okay? Now, there's also different things where if somebody tends to have a longer torso when they squat, and especially if they have a long torso and long femurs, as they squat, their upper body angle is going to be directed way down more towards the floor. So their degree of flexion at their hip is going to be greater, like a greater degree of flexion compared to somebody with short femurs or a short torso. And the more forward you have to tilt during your squats, the safer and better it is for you to have your eyes downward. If you have a very uprighted squat naturally, because you have short femurs or a short torso, then you can go ahead and have your eyes higher and it won't have as negative of an effect. So that's another thing to consider versus being flexible or not flexible, is also, do you have long femurs, do you have long torso? So how angled down to the floor does your chest have to be for you to squat the parallel? If you have to get a pretty severe angle, if your chest has to go down to the floor a lot, you're probably going to need to have your eyes down. So, if you're getting advice from someone who isn't built like you, they will likely have their head in a different position, and it'll be correct for their body type. If you are built differently, and they make you do their cues, you will feel uncomfortable, and that's the downside when people give advice and they don't know what I'm telling you. So when somebody's giving you advice but they don't know the difference between being hypermobile versus not mobile, or long femurs and torsos versus short femurs and torsos, they're just going to give you advice based on what they know, which is inadequate and incomplete. So they're going to give you the advice that works for them, or that has worked for a lot of their clients who happened to be similarly built to them. They haven't figured out yet, as trainers and people who give advice, that, wow, the people who are built differently than me need to do things differently than me. So they're going to give you their advice, it's going to feel uncomfortable for you, and you're going to feel like somehow you're wrong or there's something wrong with you. No, their advice is shit. They don't know what they're talking about. And that is so unfortunate, that because a lot of people end up getting, they kind of forced into these painful positions. They don't know any better, their trainer doesn't know any better, so they just keep training, and all of a sudden their hips hurt, or their lower back hurts, or their knee hurts. And then they get kind of frustrated, and they're like, oh, I'm just never meant to be strong. Whenever, if you were just put in the healthier position for your body type, you'd be a freaking monster, and you'd be feeling great. So it's really frustrating whenever somebody gives advice and they don't know the things that are in this podcast. Now, I am still learning. I'm sure if I made this podcast in a year from now, I'll have more information to give to you guys. And I'm sure if I made it a year ago, I might not know some of the things I know now. So every trainer that you're getting advice from is always developing and learning. But make sure that if you are getting advice from someone, that they have a history of improvement. If they have a history of learning, talk to them about who do they learn from. Ask them oh, you told me to have my head up. Do you ever have clients have your head down? And if they go, oh no, you would never have your head down, fire that person immediately. Okay? Immediately. So they should know that people are built differently. So when they give you advice, ask them the counterpoint and say, oh, have you ever told somebody differently? And if they always say, no, this is the way we do it, then fire them. Okay? So, with deadlifts, if we look at kind of head angle, a sumo deadlift for most people is a more uprighted torso position. than a conventional deadlift. So if you do a sumo deadlift, you're going to be more comfortable usually with your eyes parallel to the floor or your head slightly up. If you're doing a conventional deadlift, do not have your head up. And for most people, even their eyes parallel with the floor is too angled up. It'll cause that arching, it'll cause that rib cage to be lifted, it'll cause their lower back to be contracted, their abs to be disengaged, and then sometimes people put a belt on and say push your belly into the belt, and that actually just makes things worse. And then all of a sudden they'll wonder why when they go to push off the floor they have no leg drive and their back hurts immediately. And it's because your head is in the wrong position for a conventional deadlift. So you want to have your head, your eyes actually angled downward slightly. So that way the angle of your neck matches the angle of your torso. So that way your spine is more neutral. That'll put you in not only a stronger position, but a safer position and your back won't hurt. So understanding the differences between upper body tilts, whether you're uprighted or forward tilted, and whether that's you're doing a certain position like a sumo versus a conventional, or whether it's body types, whether you have a long torso, short torso, long femur, short femur, all that stuff plays into a role, okay? So that's some things to think of with head angle, is try everything a little bit. So if you've always done head up, try head neutral or head down. If you've always done head down, try head neutral or head up. Mix it around a little bit. But I wanted you guys to hear the differences, so that way you'll be more likely to pick the right one for your body type and what type of lift you're doing. And then also you can hear that there's permission and it's absolutely okay for people to lift differently. So I do conventional deadlifts and my head is pretty much straight down to the floor when I deadlift. Now, do all of my conventional deadlift clients have their heads in the same position? No. Do I have clients that do sumo deadlift even though I don't do sumo deadlift? Hell yeah. So we pick whatever lift is best for them and whatever position is best for them, not what's best for me. So that's my job as a trainer, to know how to use the information of a proper setup for the body type that is presented to me. Not what works for me must work for everyone else. Bullshit. Doesn't work that way. Okay? Now, the next thing we're going to look at is neutral hip position. So when you're squatting and deadlifting, we want our hips to remain not fully tilted forward, and they're not going to be certainly tilted backward. So it'd almost be like you're kind of like tucking your butt underneath you when you squat. Most people don't do that. If anything, they're going to roll their hips forward, where it's almost like the front of their hip drops down to the ground, and it closes down the distance between the front of their hip and their quads. Because that way, when they get to the parallel, they can have a bracing and support system, because the front of their hip is kind of hitting into their quad, and that gives them stability in their hips. The downside is that means your hips are out of position. So your hips are rotated forward. If you have any kind of thickness or mobility issues, that'll mean you don't get to parallel. If you can get to parallel in that position, that's going to be kind of a bummer, because you won't be forced to change. So sometimes people are mobile enough to where if their hip position is forward and their lower back is arched, and that's a weaker position because your abdominal wall is not going to be tight. Again, people put a belt on and push their belly into the belt, and that just makes things worse. Okay? That just furthers the problem. So what happens for people, if they can get to parallel with a bad hip tilt position, they'll just run into a wall of strength where they can't seem to get any stronger, and they'll notice their knees will start to cave in if they try to go up anymore. And that means their hips are not in the proper hip tilt position. So if your knees are caving in on a squat, you need to really pay attention to your hip angle. So see if the front of your hips are tilted forward. And you can watch that from the side angle video of your squat and see if you can correct that. Okay, you need your hip to be neutral. So that way you have stability and bracing through your abdominal wall, your obliques, and your spinal erectors. That's where your bracing comes from. And your body won't need to dump its hips forward to find bracing where the seam of the hip hits into the quad. So that's a big thing to look for. Now, how do we maintain a neutral hip position? If you struggle with that, is one of the biggest muscular biggest muscles involved in that is your psoas muscle. It's actually spelled P-S-O-A-S. So it's pronounced psoas, so the P doesn't have any sound to it. But that's what you'd want to search, okay, on YouTube or something, or Google, is psoas, P-S-O-A-S. And there are exercises you can do to help strengthen your psoas muscles. So I'll let you guys search through that. Maybe I'll make a separate podcast on that because it's a pretty long topic. But training your psoas muscles and strengthening them will help you a lot okay, to make sure that you can maintain a neutral hip position, and then also stretching your hip flexors. So again, you can search for hip flexor stretches. So that you want to put both of those together. So if you notice your hip angle tilting forward as you squat down and you're losing neutral hip position, you need to strengthen your psoas and you need to stretch and loosen and open up your hip flexors. You may even need to strengthen your hip flexors. It depends on why they're tight. So most people's hip flexors are tight because we spend most of the day sitting. Some people's hip flexors are tight because they have weak hip flexors, they have weak abs, they have weak psoas. They don't have anything super strong, so the body just cranks down on the hip flexors and finds stability and strength by just locking them in place. So, almost every single person I work with does abdominal training at the beginning of their programming. So, especially for my strength athletes, because ab strength is extremely important. So they'll train their abs 3 to 4 times a week. I try to train my abs about 5 or 6 days a week, even if it's just like a quick 3 or 4 minute something before I leave the gym that day. But I'll also do breathing and bracing drills all the time, so I practice that stuff while I'm training my clients actually. So back whenever I had my first ever kind of back injury, which was deadlifting with shit form before I knew what I was doing, I was lifting with a really strong friend, but neither one of us really knew what good form was, so I got hurt. And from that, I had to learn. I have a slip disc in my back, so if you look at the x-rays, you can go down the discs in my back, and then all of a sudden there's one sticking out to the left. And so I had to learn how to breathe and brace to protect that disc. So I did a lot of breathing and bracing drills while I would train clients. So while they were doing a set of 20 of something, I'd be counting the 20 reps, I'd be watching their form, but I'd also be flexing like my obliques or doing a vacuum pose to try to strengthen my like internal abdominal muscles. So I'd be doing odds and ends and stuff like that while I was training clients actually. So, but that's what you want to do, is you want to strengthen your psoas, make sure your hip flexors are neutral, make sure they're loose, and then just continue to try to strengthen your abs and do a lot of core work. Okay? Try to train your core at least a minimal 2 times a week. 3 or 4 is better. Okay? Now, the other thing we have with neutral hip position is don't push your stomach, your belly button, into the belt. So if you're wearing a belt, don't push your belly forward. You want to pull air into you as you breathe and try to push your obliques outward into the sides of the belt. So practice that a little bit. You can take your thumbs and push inward on your obliques, which is the side of your side muscles of your core. So you can push into your obliques. What I want you to then try with your thumbs pushed into your obliques is try to take a big breath, and flex your obliques like you're pushing your thumbs outward, okay, to the sides. That's how you want to brace with a belt on. Do not push your belly button forward into a belt. That'll cause you to arch your lower back. You'll actually lose abdominal tightness and actually cause more back strain. Instead, you want to breathe air in and push your obliques into the sides of the belt. That'll maintain a more neutral kind of core position, so your rib cage won't lift, your belly won't loosen, so extend. It'll actually keep everything more neutral, so from your hip to your shoulder, you'll stay in a straight line better. You're also going to be a hell of a lot stronger when your obliques are flexed. Cool. Now, real quick, we go through balance point in your feet. So if you know your head angle, if you found the one that matches your body type and the lift that you're doing, depending on your torso tilt, then we had neutral hip position. So you want to make sure you're training your abs as often as you can. Make sure you're training the psoas and you're stretching your hip flexors. So that'll help a ton too. When you wear a belt, make sure you're pushing your obliques, not your belly button. And then you want to look at the balance point in your feet. So when you squat or deadlift, you don't want your weight in your toes, in the front of your foot. Most people will do that accidentally or without knowing it, so unintentionally, because most people are quad dominant. They're going to be stronger in their quads than they are in their hamstrings and glutes. When you lean forward into your toes, that gives more weight to your quadriceps and reduces the involvement of your glutes and hamstrings. That might feel good now, but that will not make you the strongest you can eventually be. So if we think of just the 3 muscles of glutes, hamstrings, and quads, is our strongest position would be an even involvement of all 3, right? So if I have 3 people who could do work for me, and I only give one of them 80% of the work, I'm underusing the other 2 and overworking the one. So if I'm in my toes and I'm overworking my quads and I'm underusing my glutes and hamstrings, I just won't be able to display as much strength as I really have because I'm not in an even position. Okay? So that's also typically common when people arch their back and they have their head up. It tends to push them forward into their toes. So if your chin is up, your back is arched, and you're forward into your toes, that will 100% be the reason why your back hurts when you squat or deadlift, especially conventional deadlifting. So if your chin is up and you're in your toes, conventional deadlifts are going to feel like garbage. Okay, they'll feel awful, awful, awful. Now, do we want our weight in our heels? Not really either. If your weight is all the way back in your heels, you're actually turning off your quads. So you're doing the opposite thing. So instead of giving your quads all the weight whenever you're in your toes, if you go all the way to your heels, you give the weight to your hamstrings and glutes, but not really anything with your quads. So if you're doing a conventional deadlift, you won't have a very good quad drive off the floor. It doesn't affect you as much in a sumo deadlift, but you still want to get your quads involved if you can. And then with squatting, it's just going to be a good balance point as well. And again, you want to use all the muscles available rather than being pushed into one side or the other, okay, of the body, front or back. Now, where we do want our weight is midfoot. So you kind of want, like, pretending like the middle of your foot, where your arch is where all of your weight is. So I kind of mostly tell people is if you think of the heel of your foot, instead of being on the back of your heel, or even the center of your heel, try to be on the front of your heel. So not all the way into the toes, just the front of the heel. That's going to get a more even involvement of your quads, hamstrings, and glutes. And even if you're not strongest in that position right away, that's where you want to use. That's the position you want to use over time so you can develop all of your muscles equally. So I've had dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of clients at this point, where we had to change their foot positioning like this. They had to go down a little bit in their squat or deadlift until they could kind of get this movement pattern set in stone. And then all of a sudden, over a course of time, where it could be something as short as 8 weeks or it could be something as long as 6 months, all of a sudden they blow back past their old PR because they've developed a new, more even usage of their body. Okay? Now, last thing I want to touch on, if you're still with me on this, is the lockout. And this would be mostly for a deadlift, not necessarily squatting, but the same thing would apply for squats. Is when you're locking out, when you're at the top of a deadlift, okay, your glutes should be flexed, not your lower back. So you do not too often, way too often, I see people do conventional deadlifts where their belly's pushed forward, their head is up, and they get to the top of the lift, and they think their butt is flexed, but it's actually their lower back is flexed like they're going to break the damn thing. And their butt is kind of sort of contracted, but it's not squeezed all the way tight. So what happens is again, they've shoved their belly forward and they've deactivated their abs, and they're over-relying on their spinal erectors, and whenever they try to lock out, their lower back is taking a hell of a beating. So that'll be either the reason why at the medium to upper weights, their back hurts, but they can still finish the deadlift, or at the heavier weights, they can't finish the lockout because they're trying to squeeze through their lower back rather than squeezing their butt forward. When you squeeze through your lower back, it causes that forward hip tilt position, and you will not be strong. If you squeeze through your glutes, it keeps your hips neutral, and you'll be way the hell stronger, and it avoids the lower back pain because now the weight's actually in your glutes, not in your lower back. So that's a big, big, big thing. So when you do a deadlift, you want to push the bar off the floor. As the bar passes your knees, you want to squeeze your glutes towards the bar, not squeeze your lower back while still thinking of lifting the bar up to you. Once the bar passes your knees, squeeze your butt and drive your hips to the bar. Do not flex your lower back. Cool. Okay, 2 other podcasts you can listen to that might help is podcast number 229, titled Improving Weaknesses in the Squat, Bench, and Deadlift. Tons of help there. It's an hour-long podcast, lots of good stuff. And then also podcast number 117, titled Reducing Quad Dependence in Squats. That'll tell you how to kind of work on what muscles will balance out your squat and get rid of quad dependence and also get rid of lower back pain. Cool. Hopefully this podcast was helpful. And thank you for the person who sent in this request. So if anybody else has any